Hi guys, Max here, and today we're just going to talk quickly about the situation in Ukraine, what's happening on the ground, the developments in the war itself. But first, we'll start off very quickly with an update on the state of Russia itself. So let's just get right into it. So it seems immensely obvious at this point that Russia is seriously struggling under the pressure of the sanctions that have been levied against them. They are seemingly desperate to get them to end as well. They are threatening the West, claiming that they've started an economic war against Russia and threatening to escalate that war if these sanctions aren't reduced. Now, Ukraine and Russia themselves are negotiating with each other, but there doesn't seem to be any real progress over the best part of the last week. There has been one small bit of progress though. Russia's position has now evolved. It's less unreasonable than it was, but the two sides are still very far apart and it doesn't look like they're going to find a solution anytime soon. Russia wants Ukraine to cease their military action entirely, to change their constitution to enshrine themselves in neutrality so they will never be able to join an organisation like the EU or NATO, to recognise Crimea as Russian, and to recognise the two independent states of Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, this is still probably too much to ask for Ukraine. They probably won't accept this, and they're also actually in quite a strong position to negotiate from. They're holding out very well militarily, but Russia is slowly changing their position, so we might see progress there on some front in the future. Now, why is Russia moving their goalposts and changing their terms? Well, frankly, because their economy is on the brink of collapse and the military action isn't going so well. The value of the ruble dropped another 30% today, and it's now down over 80% from its highs in the past. Russian companies are struggling to find buyers for oil, even with huge discounts of sometimes $30 or more per barrel. Western companies are just refusing to buy Russian oil even if they are allowed to by sanctions because it's awful press for them, and they basically just end up forced to give their profits to Ukraine war efforts anyway. Now, natural gas is still flowing, but support for reducing imports of gas from Russia is getting stronger every day in Europe. Russian bond prices have collapsed and yields have soared as payments likely won't be made as capital markets in Russia are nearly dead. Russian banks no longer have to report their financials that they used to have to do monthly. They still have to give that information to the Russian government, but it isn't made public anymore, which means these banks are basically black boxes for investors. They are basically uninvestable. You don't know what's happening inside the bank, what money they have or what they're doing with it, their assets or anything like that. Russia itself is to disconnect from the internet next week to try and limit the Western influence on Russia's companies, their websites and their platforms. Limits have been placed on buying of simple goods in and across the country to try and prevent panic buying and shortages from emerging. Russia is even to be suspended from Interpol, the worldwide policing system, which is a major move by the world as well. Basically, sanctions on Russia are still growing. The US might ban their oil and gas imports. There are lots of concerns on the market's minds, oil and gas and wheat prices being the most important ones right now because they have all exploded and all seen limited supply. This will, of course, influence inflation, which is a major problem. It's already too high across the world. Gold prices are booming as risk on assets seem to be falling. Now, what's the situation on the ground in Ukraine in the actual war? Well, progress for Russian forces has continued to stall over recent days. Kiev is still holding out very strongly. The Russian army is unable to take control of suburb towns around the city like Hostomel or Irpin, let alone the city itself. Russian forces have also been pretty much incapable of flanking south of the city to surround it as well. There's been no progress for Russian forces on this front west of Kiev. Now, there is still a convoy north of Kiev. It's still there. It's still mostly stationary. It's not really clearing up. But there is one development regarding Kiev, and it is the Russian forces who were originally tasked with taking Chernihiv and Sumy to the north and the east of the city, but they gave up and they started making their way towards Kiev itself from the east. And those forces are almost there at the city, but progress is slow and it's seeing resistance. Chernihiv and Sumy themselves are still holding out. Again, the Russian forces are unable to move into the city and displace or destroy Ukrainian forces. We're seeing the exact same situation in Kharkiv. The Russian army is incapable of pushing into the city. When they do, they see very heavy fighting and an awful lot of dead soldiers. What has evolved on this front in particular with these cities, Sumy and Kharkiv, is that Russian bombing efforts have intensified. The Russian military has essentially resorted to trying to just destroy as much infrastructure as possible and to kill as many people as possible, even if they are civilians, because the army themselves can't take the city. Now, in the east of the country, in the Donbass, the contested areas, no progress from Russian forces once more, but there hasn't really been any progress here for the entirety of the war so far, so no surprise there. The lines of fighting still pretty much exactly represent what they were for the last 8 years as that separatist fighting has continued. There has been one small advance here in the southern part of the contested areas, as Russian forces have managed to connect with the Crimean southern invasion and help to surround Mariupol. Now, the situation in Mariupol itself is actually quite worrying. It's one of the only places of actual success for Russian forces so far. The city is entirely surrounded, and there are lots of Ukrainian armed forces and Marines in particular trapped in the city, but they're not surrendering and they're fighting very fiercely. There are loads of civilians who have been trapped there as well, and again, lots of them are being killed. Russia was supposed to, they agreed to create safe corridors for civilians to evacuate Mariupol, but Russia has continued to bomb these corridors, and they've even planted mines across them as well. Now, I'm afraid here, this is actually verified. It's 100% true. It's not Ukrainian propaganda, and this information is coming straight from the Red Cross, the well-renowned and respected worldwide charity used to operating in war zones. Now, for the rest of the invasion from Crimea targeting the south of the country, it started to stall as well. Kherson, of course, fell a few days ago without an awful lot of resistance, and the next city that was under attack was Mykolaiv, but that city is holding up very well. There are plenty of Ukrainian forces defending it, and the Russians haven't been able to make it inside the city, just like the cities in the north, Kiev and Kharkiv. Russian forces did, for some time, manage to take control of the international airport, but as of right now, Ukrainian forces have retaken it. There are some quite major fears of a Russian marine invasion of Odessa right now. It looks like there's lots of Russian navy off the coast. It looks like an invasion is coming, and that's what Western intelligence suggests, but none has come so far. This could be because there is reports of a Russian frigate that was sunk off the coast of Odessa. It's unclear if this is true or not. We do know that one was hit by Ukrainian forces, that it was on fire, but we don't know what the outcome was. Either way, this assault on Odessa has not yet started. Maybe they're waiting for support from the Crimean invasion once Russians get past or through Mykolaiv, but that doesn't seem to be coming anytime soon. Now, across the board here, we are seeing a brutalization of this war, as I said we would. As Russian forces fail to achieve their objectives, they have to change tactics, and they are resorting to killing more civilians and basically committing war crimes. Evidence of these war crimes is mounting, and civilian deaths are mounting as well. A family of 4, for example, was killed, and it was caught on camera near Kiev. Russians are basically just more willing to kill civilians right now than they were when the war started because it isn't progressing well. As earlier mentioned as well, Russia has talked about creating humanitarian corridors to allow civilians to escape and evacuate, but they've refused to actually stop firing at these corridors, killing civilians. In one particularly bad instance, 3 postal workers delivering mail to civilians in Orkhiv have been murdered by Russian troops. This is well documented and categorically true, unfortunately. Another example of crimes by Russian forces is of the Swiss journalist Guillaume Briquet. He was shot by Russian forces, thankfully he survived, but he was then robbed of his possessions, 3,000 euros, his camera equipment, his phone, basically everything he had on him, while he was clearly marked as press in a vehicle and on his clothing as well. Now, this really shouldn't be surprising. As I said, we started predicting this on day 3 of the invasion when Kiev and Kharkiv weren't falling as we thought they would. Now, what are the actual losses looking like? Well, for Ukraine, as usual, we don't have accurate figures. The Ukrainian government doesn't want to give this information over to Russia. They want to keep them in the dark. But we do know that probably thousands of civilians have been killed and likely thousands of Ukrainian soldiers killed as well. Russian casualties are now in excess of 11,000, probably something in the region of 4,000 killed, the rest captured or wounded. Again, a very high death toll for Russia. For material losses, our information is probably far more accurate. 46 fixed-wing aircraft and 68 helicopters have been destroyed on the Russian side, 290 main battle tanks, 117 artillery pieces, over 1,000 armoured personnel carriers, 23 anti-aircraft systems, and over 500 other vehicles have been destroyed. Basically, huge losses have continued, logistical problems still haven't been fixed for Russia, morale for Russian soldiers is still very poor, and they're losing high-ranking officers as well, their strategy is lacking, and the only advantage that Russia really has to press right now is in Mariupol and maybe in Mykolaiv, but the advantage there is even decreasing. Now, Russia's own security forces are seriously doubting the likelihood of winning this war in Ukraine. There is a leaked letter from a guy from the FSB which has emerged. Its authenticity is not 100% guaranteed, but it comes from actually a very reliable source, from someone who previously leaked information about Russia's torture practices a couple of years ago that is now verified as accurate. Still though, there is a chance that this comes from a biased leak. That's definitely possible, or maybe it was disinformation from Russia itself, but that's a bit unlikely as it shows the Kremlin in awful light. Now, I will link the full document down below for anyone who wants to read it, but the gist of it, the important parts are as follows. Even the FSB, the Russian equivalent of the CIA, didn't know that the war was coming. The location of Chechen forces ambushed within the first 2 days of getting into Ukraine may have been leaked, which explains why they were destroyed before even reaching combat. The FSB does not think that Russia has the capacity to occupy Ukraine. It's too big, it's too populous, and that populace is too hostile. Full mobilization of Russian forces, their armed forces, is not possible, which makes winning the war very unlikely. Even if Zelensky is killed, captured, or removed, the FSB no longer believe that Ukraine will capitulate because their resolve is too strong. The FSB have a conditional deadline of this war of June, purely because if the war isn't over by then the economy will no longer be able to support Russian forces. People will just stop getting paid their salaries, no more fuel will come across, no more supplies, things like that. Russian forces are reportedly being pulled back from Syria to assist in Ukraine. The Wagner Group, those Russian mercenaries, are being called back from Africa as well for the same reason. Now there is loads more to it. It's over 2,000 words long itself, but it is worth a read, and it paints a very poor picture for Russia, which is actually backed up by Russia's lack of progress over the last week. Now, if you enjoyed this video, then leave a like and a comment to bless the YouTube algorithm. If you want more content like this, then check out our Patreon and join our community of investors. You get access to our Discord, loads of exclusive content like insight into my portfolio and buy and sell alerts for all my own investments. There's a link in the description to masterworks.io, a site that allows you to buy fractional shares of art from world-famous artists like Banksy, which can be a great way to diversify your portfolio with non-market correlated assets. It's completely free to sign up, so if that sounds interesting, then make sure to check it out. There's also a link in the description to BlockFi, which will give you up to $250 in free Bitcoin when you use it. You can also get 9% interest on stablecoins like USDC, which is a far higher rate than you get from any savings account these days. Just make sure not to use Tether. Thank you all for the support, thanks for watching, stay stoic, until next time.